This is Red Chair Reading. I'm Hobie One. We are reading The Ghost at Skeleton Rock, Hardy Boys, number 37 by Franklin W. Dixon. This is chapter 10, Crossfire. Chet groaned in dismay at Mr. Hardy's message. To have come all the way and not go on to Puerto Rico. Jack had a different idea. Maybe it's a trick, he suggested. Yes, and the radio message too, Frank agreed. Then let's find that guy and make him talk, Joe urged. Okay, anybody see where he went? Frank asked. He and the others stared around the field. With several airliners loading and discharging passengers, the place throbbed with activity. Tourists swarmed about the terminal building. There he is, cried Tony, pointing to a tall figure in a white suit, talking earnestly to a group of men. They were standing near the roadway that bordered the field. Joe took off at a fast sprint. All the others but Jack raced after him. As the boys ran, they caught a stir of movement in other parts of the field. Several uniformed men were pushing through the throng of people. Suddenly, a shot rang out, then another. The white-suited man and his companions jerked around, their hands flying toward their hip pockets. La policia! One of them shouted, whipping out revolvers and automatics. They began shooting back. In an instant, the Hardys and their friends found themselves caught in a fusillade. I can't say the word. A fusillade of crossfire as bullets whined back and forth through the air. Wow, Tony exclaimed as one whistled close to his ear. We've walked into a war, Chet wailed. Following Joe and Frank's example, the others fanned out, but kept on running in an effort to escape the deadly exchange and catch up to the deliverer of the note. One of the gunmen spotted the Americans. He let out a sharp cry in Spanish, which seemed to throw his companions into a panic. The men ran toward two parked cars. Bringing up the rear was the mustached man in the white suit who had delivered the note. Joe was now within a couple of yards of him. With a lunge, the boy hurled himself in a fierce flying tackle. The white-suited man went down with a thud. The other gunman, already in the parked cars, made no effort to rescue their comrade. They sped off with a roar of exhaust. By this time, the police had reached the scene in jeeps to give chase, but a lieutenant and several others stayed behind to take over the prisoner from the Americans. Caramba, senores! The lieutenant exclaimed to Frank and Joe. You are brave young men, to capture unarmed such a gunman. In fact, you are all brave, senores, and I offer you my thanks. Glad to help, but who are these men? Frank asked. I imagine they're all speaking Spanish right now because Joe and Frank speak like 3 languages. One of them is Spanish. Rebels plotting against the Tropical government, said the lieutenant. But if you will be so kind, you will tell me why you are mixed up in this. Frank told his story briefly, and the officer urged the boys to accompany him to police headquarters and repeat what had happened. When they arrived at headquarters, he introduced them to Lieutenant Garcia, and once more the boys told the story. Before the officer could take action, 5 other members of the rebel group were brought in, 2 of them injured. One of the getaway cars had smashed into a lamppost while making a turn. All the occupants had been captured. A bad business, senores. You see, there have been several uprisings lately. Lieutenant Garcia explained it to the Hardys. The first took place at Santia, on the southeast coast of our island. But each new raid occurs farther west. We hear the rebels may be moving towards Savango. He explained that the police had learned only a few hours earlier about the group's latest plan to seize or blow up the airport. But why? Frank asked. What's their purpose? The lieutenant shrugged. Quien sabe? Perhaps they are criminals, crazy for power, trying to overthrow the lawfully elected government. Meanwhile, the prisoners were being questioned in another room. Frank and Joe were allowed to be present at the interrogation. It was disappointing because none of the captured men would talk. I'll bet the one we caught won't tell us anything either, Joe whispered to his brother. As Frank nodded, the man suddenly raised his hand to mop the sweat from his brow. Joe gasped and clutched his brother by the arm. Look, he whispered. On the prisoner's left forearm, just above the wrist, was a pineapple tattoo. The Hardys exchanged excited glances. Did this sign mean that the man was a member of the same racket as the one in Eastern City, and the tattoo on the left arm? The boys decided the chances were too slim for them to mention their suspicion to the Tropical police. After the prisoner had been taken to a cell, Lieutenant Garcia turned to the Hardys and said, "May I see the note, please, that was handed to you on the field?" When the officer finished studying it, Frank added, I have a hunch the radio message we got in the plane was a fake, and I'd like to make sure." He asked permission to place a long-distance telephone call to Bayport. In a few minutes, Mrs. Hardy's voice came through. "Is everything all right?" she asked quickly. "There's nothing to worry about, Mother," Frank reassured her, then asked if she had sent the radio message. "Why, no, son." Somewhat upset, Mrs. Hardy begged her sons to take care of themselves. "And that goes for Chet and Tony and Jack," she added. When Lieutenant Garcia heard Frank's report, he frowned. "It would appear, senores, that this gang was trying to lure you into some kind of trap. Fortunately, their plan failed." He summoned the prisoner who had delivered the note. The man glibly said a stranger had asked him to do the errand. Frank and Joe were sure he was lying, but he refused to change his story and was taken away to a cell. After making signed statements, the Hardys were driven back to the airport in a police car. Here they ate a hearty lunch, then took off again for Puerto Rico. "I certainly hope we have no more delays," Joe said, heaving a great sigh. It was a great afternoon when they came in sight of the beautiful Caribbean island. From the air, it looked like a paradise of emerald green. White beaches with waving palms rimmed the shoreline. Farther inland, cool blue mountains reared up from the coastal plain. "Ah, me! What a place in which to relax and dream," Chet said as he peered down from the cabin window. "You mean with a well-filled lunch basket?" Tony put in, chuckling. To the southeast of the international airport near San Juan, a green-clad mountain peak soared against the sky. "That's El Yunque." "The Anvil," Jack pointed out, "is a tropical rainforest with ferns as high as houses." They landed and admired the large, white, modernistic terminal building as they walked toward it. The structure seemed to be poised on stilts. Mr. Hardy was waiting to greet the travelers as soon as they cleared customs. "Good flight?" he asked. "Wait till you hear," Joe grinned. "We stopped off in Tropical and barged smack into a revolution." "Well, I'm glad you came through it alive." Though eager to hear all the news, Mr. Hardy cautioned everyone not to talk freely until they were in their hotel rooms. The group managed to squeeze into a single taxi. Soon, they were whisked through the beautiful residential area of pink and white villas, then out onto a wide boulevard lined by palms in clear view of the sea. "Pretty nice place," Chet remarked. "Let's have some fun while we're here and not get mixed up with a bunch of crooks." The others smiled. When they reached the hotel, the boys went at once to Mr. Hardy's room for a conference. Frank and Joe quickly related everything that had happened to them since receiving his message of "Find Hugo Purple Turban." Mr. Hardy was amazed. "So there were diamonds in the dummy. This case is even more complex than I realized," he declared, his face grave. "And you've done a good job. I thought that message might be a clue to a smuggling racket. It was written on a piece of paper left in a hastily vacated house." The detective confided to the boys that he was working for the United States government on the theft of some rare isotopes, materials which could be used in the manufacture of atomic weapons. "The FBI believes they were stolen here in Puerto Rico en route to foreign countries," he added. "It looks as if we may be up against a gang of air freight thieves and smugglers who deal in other things besides isotopes." "Any leads so far?" Frank asked. "Just one. My next job is to keep watch at a freight warehouse near the airport." Joe jumped up from his chair in excitement. "How about Frank and Chet and Tony and myself doing a stakeout at the warehouse?" The other boys were equally enthusiastic about the idea, and Mr. Hardy finally agreed. They soon devised a plan. The boys would hide in crates to be carted to the warehouse that evening. After dinner, the boys started out for a trucking company on a street called Calle Pacheco. The owner of the firm was cooperating with the police on the freight robberies. "Don't look now," said Tony a few minutes later, "but I think a car is tailing us." Frank looked forward to watch the taxi's rearview mirror. "You're right." He leaned forward. "You're right," he murmured. "Maybe we better split up." Quickly, he arranged with Chet and Tony to stay in the taxi and try to shake off their pursuer. "If you lose him, meet us at the trucking company in half an hour." 3 blocks down, the driver stopped for a red light. Quickly, the Hardys jumped from the taxi. and lost themselves in the passing throng of pedestrians. They had not gone far when Frank and Joe noticed that a tall man seemed to be trailing them. His face was almost hidden by the pulled-down brim of his slouch hat. The Hardys were struck by something familiar about the fellow. But there was no time to mull this over. "Better shake him," Frank muttered. Joe agreed. Quickly the boys hailed a taxi and resumed their ride to the trucking company. When they arrived, the owner said, "Ah, see, I have the boxes all prepared. The covers, of course, will not be nailed down." A few minutes later, Chet and Tony joined them. The boys took their places in the big crates, which were loaded aboard a truck. Soon they were bumping and rattling through the streets of San Juan. When the truck arrived at the warehouse, the boxes were carried inside to the main room. As closing time neared, the workmen's voices died away and everything became quiet. The first half hour of the boys' vigil went slowly, cramped and tense in their hiding places. They sweated out each passing moment. Then Frank heard a noise. That is the end of chapter 10. So, this is the part where I say, click the button over there for the next chapter and click this button here to subscribe.